You think going no contact protects you from a narcissist? It doesn't. Because even after you block them, they're still inside your head, rewriting your reality from the shadows. But here's the part no one tells you. You can crush a narcissist's ego without lifting a finger, saying a word, or seeking revenge. There's one psychological shift that hits them harder than anything you could ever say. I'm going to tell you exactly what that shift is and how to do it. Before I tell you exactly how to reach that level of psychological detachment, make sure you like this video, hit subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to break free, not just physically, but mentally. Because the next part is the one that finally puts you in control. When people talk about no contact, they usually imagine it as cutting communication, blocking the number, deleting the chats, removing them from social media. And yes, that's necessary, but it's not the real battle. The real battlefield is your mind, because the narcissist's most powerful weapon was never their presence. It was the mental hooks they installed long before you ever went no contact. These hooks are the doubts they planted in you, the guilt they conditioned into you, the belief that you somehow owed them explanations, apologies, or emotional labor. Even after they're gone, those hooks keep tugging. You might find yourself replaying arguments, imagining what you should have said, or wondering whether you were too harsh. You may feel compelled to prove you weren't the problem. You may still crave closure, understanding, or acknowledgement of the pain they caused. All of this keeps them psychologically alive inside you. A narcissist operates like malware. Even after you uninstall the program, fragments keep running in the background unless you deliberately clear them out. No contact stops the external damage, but internal damage continues if you're still running their script. They trained you to question yourself, to prioritize their reactions, to protect their ego, to manage their moods. Those patterns don't disappear just because you block them. They linger as automatic habits, over-explaining, apologizing too quickly, fearing rejection, or believing you have to earn love. When these habits run, they still have control. Their ego doesn't need physical access to survive. It only needs you to keep revolving emotionally around them. This is why no contact is not enough. Without mental detachment, you're still reacting to a person who isn't even present, which means they still occupy the most valuable space you have, your attention. For a narcissist, attention is currency, and the moment you stop giving it, even privately in your mind, their hold on you dissolves. You start reclaiming your power when you recognize that the story they taught you about yourself was never true, and you stop allowing their voice to shape your self-worth. This is when their ego actually takes the hit, when you no longer think in relation to them at all. People often assume that the way to hurt a narcissist is to confront them, expose them, or finally tell them everything they put you through. But none of that actually dents their ego, because confrontation still gives them something they crave: your emotional intensity, anger, frustration, heartbreak, even attempts at closure, all of it signals that you're still affected by them. A narcissist interprets that as proof of their importance. This is why shouting at them, blocking them dramatically, or sending long explanations never lands the way you imagine. It doesn't shake them, it feeds them. It reassures them that they still exist in your emotional world. What a narcissist cannot tolerate is emotional indifference. Not silence that drips with pain, not silence that waits for them to notice, but silence that comes from true detachment. When you stop explaining, stop defending, stop trying to win, fix, or justify, you cut off the emotional supply that fuels their sense of superiority. They thrive on seeing you react because reaction means relevance. Once your reactions disappear, they feel a kind of ego starvation. They don't know what to do with a version of you that no longer moves toward them or away from them, doesn't resist or cling, doesn't blame or beg. Indifference removes their power because their entire identity depends on being able to provoke emotional disruption in others. This is why trying to beat them emotionally never works. The moment you're trying, you've already lost. The only thing that actually destabilizes their ego is showing them that they no longer have access to your inner world. Indifference tells them they no longer matter, and irrelevance is the deepest wound for someone whose entire self is built on external validation. When your emotional landscape becomes neutral in relation to them, they experience something they rarely feel: insignificance. They may lash out, try to hoover, provoke you, or pretend you never mattered. All of these are attempts to recover the emotional fuel you quietly took away. Indifference is not about pretending not to care. It's about genuinely no longer needing them to understand, acknowledge, or validate anything. This is the moment their ego begins to collapse internally, because for the first time, they are not being fed by the emotional reaction they counted on to feel powerful. Shifting your internal narrative is essential because narcissists don't just control your behavior when you're with them, they control the story you tell yourself even after they're gone. During the relationship, they slowly train you to doubt your own perceptions and replace them with theirs. They make you question your memory, your motives, your worth, and even your emotional reactions. Over time, you begin to believe that their interpretation of events holds more weight than your own. This is why, even after no contact, you may still hear their voice in your mind, criticizing you, correcting you, or minimizing what happened. That voice keeps you psychologically tethered to them long after the relationship ends. The shift happens when you stop letting their narrative define your reality. Instead of repeating their words, "You're too sensitive," "You're overreacting," "It wasn't that bad," "You're the problem," you start replacing them with your own truth, your version of events, your understanding of what happened, because the narcissist's ego thrives on rewriting your reality. The moment you reclaim your perspective, their influence starts dissolving. This isn't about positive thinking or forced confidence. It's about undoing years of psychological conditioning that taught you to blame yourself for their behavior. It's about recognizing that their manipulation was deliberate, patterned, and predictable, not a response to something you did wrong. When you shift the narrative from self-blame to self-clarity, you remove the guilt and confusion that kept you emotionally attached. You stop defending their actions to yourself. You stop making excuses for them. You stop rewriting history in their favor. And most importantly, you stop believing that their lack of empathy says anything about your worth. Their behavior becomes a reflection of their limitations, not your failures. This internal shift is far more powerful than external distance because once the story changes inside you, their psychological grip breaks. You begin to see the relationship for what it actually was rather than what you were. Manipulated into believing. And when that clarity settles in, their ego loses the invisible control it once had over your mind. A narcissist's ego doesn't crumble when you argue with them, expose them, or finally walk away. Those things barely graze them because they can twist the narrative into something that still places them at the center. What truly disrupts a narcissist is emotional detachment, not silence rooted in pain, not silence waiting for them to notice, but silence that signals you no longer feel anything toward them. They need emotional reactions the way a fire needs oxygen. Your hurt, your anger, your confusion, your attempts to understand or fix things, all of that feeds them. It confirms they still matter, that they still have emotional gravity in your life. As long as you are emotionally entangled, they still feel powerful. Detachment is different from disappearing. Detachment means there is no internal movement toward them anymore. Their messages don't spark adrenaline. Their name doesn't tighten your chest. Their behavior no longer sends you into analysis mode. When you stop reacting internally, you starve the ego that once fed on your confusion and vulnerability. Narcissists crave emotional chaos because it gives them control, and they know how to manipulate people who are still invested. When that investment vanishes, their influence collapses. They can't hook you into arguments, guilt, or nostalgia. They can't bait you into re-explaining yourself. They can't provoke you into defending your character. You no longer dance to their emotional rhythm, and that absence is what disorients them. What makes emotional starvation so threatening to a narcissist is that it exposes the truth they work desperately to hide. Without someone to feed on, their sense of self falls apart. They cannot generate self-worth internally. They rely entirely on extracting it from others. When you detach, you remove yourself as a source, and they feel the void immediately. They might rage, hoover, smear, or pretend they don't care, but those reactions are evidence of the wound. Detachment forces them to face their own emptiness, and that is something they spend their entire lives avoiding. Emotional starvation isn't about punishing them. It's about reclaiming your inner peace so completely that they cease to exist as a psychological presence. That absence is the blow their ego cannot recover from. Physical silence is easy. You can block a number, delete a chat, unfollow an account. But emotional silence is where the real work happens, because that silence isn't about what you do. It's about what you no longer feel compelled to do. Narcissists don't panic when you stop talking to them. They panic when you stop reacting to them. Internally, they can sense the difference. If your silence is filled with pain, longing, confusion, or the hope that they'll notice, they still feel in control. They know you're emotionally tied to them, and that tie is the leash they've always pulled. Emotional silence means something else entirely. It means you're no longer scanning for their reactions, no longer replaying their words, and no longer adjusting yourself to avoid upsetting them. It means their emotional weather no longer determines your inner climate. Narcissists survive on emotional energy, not just the emotions you express outwardly, but the emotions you generate inwardly. If you're still anxious about their opinion of you, still trying to understand why they behaved the way they did, or still hoping one day they'll acknowledge the pain they caused, you're not actually silent. You're still participating emotionally, even if no words are spoken. Emotional silence is when you stop giving them space in your mind. You stop rehearsing conversations that never happened. You stop imagining future encounters. You stop carving out mental room for someone who showed you repeatedly they wouldn't do the same for you. This kind of silence dismantles the power imbalance they built. It breaks the psychological feedback loop they rely on to feel superior. When they can no longer provoke a reaction from you, not through manipulation, guilt, nostalgia, or even their absence, they lose the emotional leverage that made them feel special. They no longer get to feed on your confusion or your desire for closure. Emotional silence tells them you've reached a place they cannot access or influence. It's the point where your healing becomes louder than their chaos. And nothing injures a narcissist's ego more than realizing that their name, their presence, and their memory no longer have the power to disturb your peace. When you stop performing, justifying, or explaining yourself, you shut down the very system the narcissist depends on to maintain control. They train you to believe that you owe them emotional labor. The constant clarifying, defending, proving, and smoothing over that keeps you trapped in their distorted reality. Every time you explain your intentions, defend your character, or try to clarify misunderstandings they intentionally created, you reinforce their power. You're essentially saying, your interpretation of me matters more than my own. And that's exactly what they want. They want to be the judge, the jury, and the narrative keeper of your life. The moment you remove the need to be understood by them, the dynamic shifts. You begin operating from a place they cannot reach because they no longer have the ability to manipulate your sense of self. Narcissists manipulate through confusion, by twisting your words, dismissing your feelings, and pulling you into endless loops of explanations that never resolve anything. They never listen to understand. They listen to regain control. They want you exhausted, off balance, and emotionally dependent on their approval. When you stop explaining, you break the cycle of validation seeking that they rely on. Justifying yourself is another form of emotional surrender. It means you're still hoping they'll see your perspective, acknowledge your intentions, or treat you fairly if only you explain well enough. But narcissists don't reward clarity, they punish it. The more you clarify, the more they distort. The more you defend yourself, the more they attack. The more you try to reason with them, the more unreasonable they become. They don't want resolution, they want dominance. Removing the impulse to justify or perform takes their oxygen away. You stop reacting on their emotional timeline. You stop giving them the reassurance that they still have influence. Your silence, your refusal to argue, your lack of defensiveness. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs that you're no longer willing to participate in a game rigged against you. And nothing destabilizes a narcissist more than realizing they can no longer provoke you into defending your worth or explaining your existence. That's the moment they feel the loss because the control they once held over your identity slips right out of their hands. Rebuilding your identity after a narcissist isn't just healing, it's liberation. Narcissists don't just damage your confidence, they shape the version of you that serves their needs. They train you into a role: the fixer, the pleaser, the apologizer, the stabilizer, the one who absorbs their chaos so they don't have to face it. By the time the relationship ends, you've been living as an edited version of yourself, trimmed down and reshaped to avoid triggering their rage, their insecurity, or their silent punishments. When you finally step away, you don't just lose them, you lose the self you used to be before they rewrote your emotional wiring. Rebuilding your identity means intentionally stepping out of the mold they forced you into. The narcissist thrives on the version of you that needs their approval, chases their validation, fears their withdrawal, or tries to prove your worth through sacrifice. When you start rebuilding, you become unrecognizable to them, not because you change into someone new, but because you return to someone authentic. You start making choices based on your values instead of their reactions. You stop apologizing for existing. You stop shrinking yourself so they can feel bigger. You rediscover interests, dreams, and traits they once mocked, minimized, or discouraged. And slowly, the version of you they crafted loses relevance. This evolution wounds them because narcissists need you frozen in the identity they assigned you. They need you predictable, pliable, and emotionally dependent. When you grow beyond that, their ego feels threatened. They lose the psychological blueprint that once allowed them to manipulate you effortlessly. Your confidence becomes a barrier. Your clarity becomes a shield. Your self-trust becomes something they can no longer penetrate. A narcissist cannot control someone who knows who they are. Rebuilding your identity is not about revenge or proving anything to them. It's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that were silenced, dismissed, or reshaped for their benefit. And the deeper truth is this: nothing crushes a narcissist's ego more than realizing you became stronger because of the very pain they tried to use to destroy you. When you rebuild, you break the cycle. When you rediscover who you are, they lose the version of you they depended on. And that loss hits harder than anything you could ever say. The deepest blow to a narcissist's ego isn't your anger, your tears, or even your silence. It's the moment you no longer feel anything connected to them. They can survive being hated. They can survive being confronted. They can survive you leaving. What they cannot survive is emotional irrelevance. The narcissist's entire sense of power comes from your reactions, your confusion, your attempts to understand them, and the emotional turbulence they create inside you. As long as you feel something intense, love, pain, guilt, fear, hope, they still hold a position of psychological importance in your life. When you reach the point where their name doesn't trigger a memory loop, their behavior doesn't demand analysis, and their absence doesn't ignite longing, that is when their ego experiences the deepest fracture. Narcissists rely on emotional resonance. They need to know they can still influence your inner world even if they're no longer physically present. The moment that emotional resonance disappears, they lose what they consider proof of their superiority. They don't view emotions the way healthy people do. To them, your emotional reaction is a scoreboard. No reaction means they are no longer winning. Feeling nothing doesn't mean you become numb or cold. It means you finally place them in the correct emotional category, irrelevant. They are no longer the person you need answers from, understanding from, or closure from. The emotional loop is closed not because they offered resolution, but because you outgrew the need for it. They can't reach that place. They can only trigger emotions in people who still care on some level, even if that care shows up as anger or heartbreak. When you become emotionally neutral, you stop being a source of supply. They can't provoke, guilt, gaslight, hoover, or confuse you back into giving them the validation they hunger for. That disconnection forces them to confront the emptiness they constantly run from, the emptiness they masked with your emotional energy. And while you're not doing it to hurt them, it hurts them anyway, because their ego depends on being unforgettable. Your emotional freedom is the one outcome they never believed possible.